Hello, I'm Dorothy Linthicum with a follow-up conversation about how those of us over 70 are living with the solitude of enforced separation during the COVID-19 pandemic. In our last conversation, I talked briefly about memory boxes and how we can use their prompts to take us to a favorite time in our lives. Before we look at putting a memory box together ourselves, I want to share some ideas from theorists who have studied the value of our memories in navigating the present. I'll begin with Robert Butler, who was a physician, gerontologist, psychiatrist, and the first director of the National Institute on Aging. In 1963, he wrote an article for the journal Psychiatry titled The Life Review, an interpretation of reminiscence in the aged. In this article, he strongly defended the tendency of older people to slip into old memories as healthy, and he gave it the name Life Review. He argued that this tendency was a naturally occurring, universal mental process characterized by the progressive return to consciousness of past experiences, and particularly the resurgence of unresolved conflicts. He found this to be particularly true as death nears and a person is no longer able to maintain their personal invulnerability. Even those of us who are in good health and lead active lives find that a pandemic threatens our sense of personal invulnerability. How our specific bodies might react to the virus is completely unknown. Butler added that by reviewing past experiences, old conflicts can be surveyed and reintegrated into the stories of our lives, prompted by the realization of our inability to maintain a sense of personal invulnerability. In other words, says James Thorson, formerly with the Department of Gerontology at the University of Nebraska, a life review gives us a rationalization in which we can persuade ourselves that we've led pretty good lives. Butler believes that just sitting still and listening to older people talk about their lives is grace. It may not be requested, but it can be freely given and makes life worth living. Although we may be forced to be in separate spaces, we can offer each other that grace in a phone conversation or a Skype or Zoom video. Explaining ourselves, Thorson adds, and finding that we are pretty good people after all, is like forgiveness of sin. Acceptance of who we are is what we strive for and is what, he says, gives meaning to life. Butler agrees that moments of deep listening are perhaps the most important thing that we can do for each other. Looking back at our spiritual lives can be an enriching experience for people of all ages. Author and Yale professor Mary Clark Moschella suggests that spiritual autobiography groups provide a pastoral ministry that can deepen the lives of older adults, their families, and entire congregations. Telling our life stories, writes Moschella, is a brave and daring endeavor. It involves naming one's own reality, calling it something, just as God called worlds into being. The very act of composing one's own story is an exercise of freedom that holds the potential to empower and enliven the author. If the story that is shared is received or heard in a thoughtful and respectful manner, the person's feeling of clarity and well-being will likely be magnified. There is blessed relief that comes from the feeling of being understood and known by another. She goes on to say that congregations often under-recognize and underuse the wisdom of older people. While clergy and lay leaders may recognize a duty to offer care to the elderly, rarely is the idea of ministry with older adults fully embraced or realized. Using storytelling across generations, she believes, opens resources for spiritual growth for people of all ages. Moschella suggests that stories be spoken aloud in worship or in other congregational gatherings or recorded and written for family or church activities. Listening to the life stories of older adults, she says, is indeed an act of love, one that can enrich the lives of congregants of all ages. Story listening can reveal the spiritual dimensions of elders' lives that often go untapped and even unnamed. Questions that get at issues of values, transcendence, hope, or despair can bring forth the kind of stories that matter most to both teller and listener. Such stories are worth telling, hearing, and remembering in communities of faith. In my last conversation with my peers living in solitude for their safety and the health of others, I mentioned memory boxes, real boxes filled with memory cues that include written stories, poetry, photos, music, scrapbooks, and other memorabilia. In working with groups, I have been more successful using memory boxes than endeavoring in spiritual autobiographies. Both help people remember and hold on to their stories, though. I learned about memory boxes too late for my mom and dad, both who died of Alzheimer's-related issues. But they both, and especially my dad, taught me how memories can bring a moment of joy or a flash of contentment that benefited us all. When I realized that I needed to move my dad closer to my own home, I began looking for mementos in the house that he had lived in for over 50 years. I worried about uprooting him from familiar surroundings and hoped that I could identify items that would be comforting. He was born in Oklahoma and had spent all his life there except during his deployment during World War II. My husband used to say that if you pricked his finger, he would bleed Oklahoma. I carefully packed up plaques and certificates honoring the work he did as president of his accounting association and at his church, where he was deacon emeritus. I brought the covered cookie jar that he had used for over 30 years, which I remember as never being empty. I carried the scrapbook he had compiled about his World War II experiences on the plane with us, not trusting moving companies or the mail. I found pictures and keepsakes of his 50-plus years of marriage to my mother, including their courtship on an air base in southern Oklahoma. Almost as an afterthought, I threw in a class photo from his grade school in Waukomis and a skunk trap he had used as a boy to earn extra spending money. I filled his apartment in an assisted living facility with the items I brought from his home. I hung the plaques and certificates, prominently displayed photos of him with my mother, filled the cookie jar with his favorite cookies, displayed his World War II scrapbook, and stocked a small refrigerator with items I knew he enjoyed. Soon I realized that the plaques and certificates were part of a past he simply did not remember. His memories of my mother folded into my ongoing presence, where wife-daughter became a single person in his mind. The cookies, similar to items in the refrigerator, were never eaten, out of sight, out of mind. The mementos that sparked conversations between us were his World War II scrapbook, the class photo, the skunk trap, and my unreliable memory of stories he had told us about growing up on a farm. He could tell me the names of every single person in the class photo, about 25 in all. He remembered Christmas dinner on the barren island off of Africa, where he was stationed during the war. And I only had to start a childhood story about his cousins, and he would finish it. I've often wondered what he would have included in a memory box for himself. Maybe he would have focused on the latter part of his life as I had. But our experience together has made me reach back to my earliest memories as I continue to add items to my own box. So the power of memory boxes is not limited to people who have dementia or even older adults. Although memories can at times be devastating, they also have the power to heal us at different points in our lives. Curating a memory box's contents over time can help us remember our stories and mark our spiritual growth. I want to invite you to take a closer look at my memory box. If you want more information about making your own memory box, you can read a brief article I wrote that is posted on a website called Building Faith. The link is on the slide with my memory box and included in the written description of this video. So, what kind of box do you use? What is the box itself? Well, this is mine. I suggest you find one that's sturdy. Make it something that stands out a little bit, which makes it less likely to be misplaced or jammed into another box where it could be lost forever. My box was part of a Vacation Bible School kit. For years at Virginia Seminary, I was the VBS queen, reviewing so many materials and resources I lost count. So just picking up this box, brings back memories of curriculum reviews, VBS fairs, and colleagues who worked with me over the years. When I open it, the first thing I see is a picture album of my childhood that my mother put together when I got married over 50 years ago. From the first house we lived in, through my many birthday parties and places we went to, and family gatherings, the past is really captured in these early photos. My mother also thoughtfully included names of people who were in them. At the very front of the album, I've taken out a special picture that I wanted to be sure that I could see at all times. I'm sitting with one of my mother's best friends, who was like my second mother, especially after my own mother died. I have a later photo of the two of us in my parents' home. The same love continued and endured. Next in my box is a story I wrote, the first of many I hope to compose in the next few years. I have a special folder in my computer for these musings. As you can see, it's only 1 page long. So before the story begins is a note. When you read this story to me, if possible, please have on hand a carton of raspberries. Let them sit in a sunny place until the chill of the refrigerator is gone, and they are softened by the warmth and their aroma fills the air. Before you begin, let me savor a raspberry on my tongue. The final items in my box relate to music. In my study of aging, I discovered that music may be the most important thing that we can offer to older people to help them ease the anxieties and to live into the moment. This is the 1956 Baptist hymnal that I grew up with in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I know many of the songs by heart, and when I close my eyes, I can hear the different vocal parts that fill the sanctuary of Emmanuel Baptist Church at Sunday night hymn sings. I have been an Episcopalian for almost 50 years, but the hymns of the 1972 Episcopal hymnal just don't pull at my heart like the ones from my childhood. And finally, there is an iPod loaded with my favorite music, from orchestral pieces to Broadway musicals. It's tiny, it doesn't take up much space, it has ear connections, and I have a charger that I have with it as well. My children have been tasked with keeping the technology current. We have seen older people, as I said earlier, filled with anxiety, relax as they listen to music that still fills their hearts. It does that for me as well. Whether we relive our stories in solitude or tell them within our families or in a more formal spiritual autobiography groups at church, it is the sharing of memories that enriches lives. Here's a story a friend shared with me about memory boxes several years ago. When Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, Roger thought his family would be able to ride out the storm in their home. He and his wife Kristen and teenage daughter Riley had recently moved to the area from South Carolina. As the rains continued to pound the region, they realized they needed to move to higher ground. They grabbed a few items, including Scout their dog, and drove to the home of new friends, a safe haven amid the destruction that surrounded them. Roger described on Facebook what happened later that night. "Dad, look what I packed." Our almost grown woman-child Riley stands in the doorway with a lidded box, about the size of a shoebox. "It's my memory box," she said. "I started filling it up long ago, and I kept filling it. I didn't want to leave it. You want to look at it with me?" She looked like the 3-year-old I remembered and the 27-year-old that I can't wait to hang out with. So we did. Right there on the floor of someone else's home, a home that has become our safe place for now. There were photos, postcards, Adele tickets, letters, and more. She told me about every one of them. For a brief moment, we were transported back in time, far away from falling rain and worry. We are family, and we are going to be okay. I know I will have a few things to add to my memory box. I hope you find some time during the enforced solitude of this pandemic to spend time with old memories and maybe, just maybe, start your own memory box.